Look at the light coming through your window and you'll see it. Dust, drifting, the most boring thing in your house. The last time this planet froze, that dust fell so thick and for so long that it buried whole countries, and it is the only reason anyone survived to be born. You've seen the picture of the Ice Age. Everyone has. A wall of white, snow to the horizon, a figure in fur, head down, pushing through a blizzard that never stops. Mammoths going gray behind the falling flakes. Now delete it. That picture didn't come from a dig site. It came from illustrators and film studios, and it has been copied so many times that it stopped feeling like a guess and started feeling like a memory. It isn't. It's a drawing. Because the strangest fact about the Ice Age, the one that took scientists nearly a century of drilling to accept, is that it barely snowed. Think about that for a second. The coldest stretch of time our species has ever lived through, the period we literally named after ice, and the sky above it was mostly empty. Clear. Dry. Dry the way a desert is dry. So where did all the ice come from? And if the snow wasn't falling, what was? That's the question this whole video is built around, and the honest answer is that it doesn't come from one discovery. It comes from 8 separate places on this planet, each one holding a piece. A hole drilled 2 miles into Antarctica, a lake in Africa that almost vanished, a frozen bison pulled out of a gold mine, a village built out of powder, and a single week in Siberia in 2013 where 61,000 animals died in a way that explains all of it. We'll get there. Start with the hole. 800,000 years of sky, stacked dome sea, East Antarctica, 75 degrees south. There is nothing here. No mountains, no coast, no life. 3 kilometers of ice sitting on top of a buried continent, and an average temperature that makes a domestic freezer feel tropical. Between 1996 and 2004, a European team called EPICA, the European Project for Ice Coring in Antarctica, drilled straight down into it. They pulled up a cylinder of ice 3,270 meters long. That column of ice is not a lump of frozen water. It's a stack of winters. Every year, snow falls here, doesn't melt, and gets crushed by the snow of the following year. Do that without interruption, and you get a diary. Near the top, you can count the layers with your eyes, the way you'd count rings in a tree trunk. Further down, the weight above squeezes each year into a band thinner than a fingernail, and you need chemistry to read them apart. The deepest ice they reached was falling as snow 800,000 years ago, before our species existed, before any modern human had ever taken a breath. And here's the thing about that ice. When you drill a core, you go looking for what the ice can tell you about temperature. What actually screams off the page is something else entirely. Dirt. Trapped in that ice, in thin, dark bands, is dust. Mineral dust. Blown thousands of kilometers from the other end of the world, drifting down onto Antarctica and getting sealed in. There is no soil at Dome Sea. There is no rock within 1,000 kilometers. Every grain in that core arrived by air, which makes the core a rain gauge for the entire southern hemisphere. And in 2008, a researcher named Fabrice Lambert published the measurement of that dust in the journal Nature. Every layer, 8 full glacial cycles, 800,000 years of it. Here's what he found. During the warm periods, the ones like right now, the ice is clean. During the cold periods, every single one of them, the dust flux goes up by roughly 25 times. Not 25%, 25 times. Every glaciation. 8 for 8 across nearly 1 million years, the same signal. Now, here's what makes that finding so important, and it's not the number. It's what dust in the air actually requires. Dust doesn't travel through wet air. Rain scrubs it out of the sky. That's what rain does. It's the planet's air filter, and it's why the air smells clean after a storm. For dust from South America to stay airborne long enough to cross an ocean and land on Antarctica, the sky it crosses has to be dry. Lambert's team pointed straight at it. stronger sources, and dust particles surviving far longer up there because the water cycle had wound down. 25 times more dust means 25 times less washing. The ice cores didn't just record an ice age, they recorded a drought. If you're finding this as unsettling as I am, that the ice age was a desert with ice in it, subscribe, because the next station is a lake that lost almost all of its water while the north was freezing solid, and nobody expects it. Sit with the size of it. A colder atmosphere holds less water vapor. That's simple physics. The same reason your bathroom mirror fogs in a hot shower and not a cold one. Drop global temperature, and the sky's carrying capacity drops with it. Then take a third of the northern hemisphere's water and lock it up as ice sheets kilometers thick, and it never comes back down. It just sits there, growing. So the world got colder, and the colder it got, the less it snowed. The ice sheets weren't built by heavy snowfall. They were built by thin snowfall that never, ever melted. A few centimeters a year, banked for 100,000 years, with no summer big enough to spend it. That's the part that breaks most people's intuition. An ice sheet is not a record of storms. It's a record of restraint, of a climate too cold and too dry to ever undo its own work. Slow, patient, merciless. And every year that the sky failed to rain, the bare ground it left behind lifted into the wind, off dried riverbeds, off the crushed rock at the edge of the glaciers, off the exposed floor of oceans that had dropped by more than 100 meters. It went up, it traveled, and it came down somewhere else. Which raises the question that turns this whole story upside down. If it wasn't snowing on the Ice Age world, what was actually covering it? And why would anything, or anyone, choose to live there? Africa, 135,000 years ago. The lake that almost wasn't. Go to the other end of the planet, 10 degrees south of the equator, in the southern African tropics. There's a body of water called Lake Malawi. It's one of the deepest lakes on Earth, a crack in the continent filled to 700 meters, holding more fish species than any other lake in the world. In March 2005, a team led by Christopher Schultz of Syracuse University did something absurd. They trucked an ocean drilling rig overland into landlocked Africa, mounted it on a rented barge, floated it out over the deepest water, lowered the drill string almost 600 meters to the lake floor, and then bored roughly another 600 meters down into the mud underneath. Nobody had ever pulled a long, continuous climate record out of the middle of the African continent before. Everything we thought we knew about the tropics during the Ice Age had been inferred from scraps of outcrop and from ocean cores hundreds of kilometers offshore. What came up was published in PNAS in 2007, and it broke the story everybody had been telling. Because between 135,000 and 75,000 years ago, Lake Malawi lost at least 95% of its water. Let that sink in. One of the great lakes of the world, one of the deepest, dropped by more than 600 meters of depth. The pollen in those layers nearly stops, meaning there wasn't enough vegetation left standing to shed it. The charcoal nearly stops too, and that detail is the one that gets me. There wasn't enough plant matter alive to sustain a serious fire. A companion study led by Andrew Cohen put the rainfall in the Malawi watershed during the worst of it under 400 millimeters a year. 400 millimeters. That is scrubland. That is the kind of number you see in the Sahel, on the edge of the Sahara, measured on the shore of what should be one of the wettest, most fertile places on the continent. And here's the part that should genuinely rearrange your mental map. Schultz's team pointed out that these African megadroughts were worse than the last glacial maximum, worse than the period everyone had assumed was the driest thing the Quaternary ever produced. So while ice sheets were thickening over Canada and Scandinavia, tropical Africa, thousands of kilometers from any glacier, was turning to dust. The Ice Age is filed in your head as a northern problem, a high-latitude problem. Something that happened to Europe and Siberia and Canada while everywhere else carried on. It wasn't. It was a planetary water shortage. The cold and the drought were the same event wearing two different coats. And if you were an early human standing on that shrinking African shoreline, you never saw a single snowflake. You just watched the water go. Which brings us to the obvious question. If the world was drying out that badly, how did anything large stay alive? And here's where it gets extraordinary, because the answer is the exact opposite of what you'd guess. Alaska, 36,000 years ago. The bison in the gold mine. July 1979. A gold mining operation outside Fairbanks, Alaska, is hosing away frozen silt to get at the gravel underneath. The water cuts through the permafrost, and something comes out of the wall. A hoof. Then a leg. Then a whole animal. They call in Dale Guthrie, a biologist at the University of Alaska. What he excavates is a complete steppe bison. Hide, hair, horn sheaths, muscle, fat, frozen solid for roughly 36,000 years. The exposed flesh had a strange blue mineral crust on it, so they named him Blue Babe, after Paul Bunyan's ox. Guthrie could read the animal's death like a police report. Claw marks on the hide, punctures in the skin spaced exactly like an American lion's canines. A piece of a lion's tooth, snapped off, still lodged in the neck. Killed in late autumn, then frozen so fast the predators couldn't finish the meal. And yes, in 1984, Guthrie and his colleagues thawed a piece of the neck and ate it in a stew. He said it was tough and tasted of the earth it had been buried in. 36,000-year-old bison. I have questions, but I also respect the commitment. Now, here's what makes Blue Babe so important, and it isn't the lion. It's the stomach and the pollen and the sediment around him. Because Guthrie spent his career reconstructing the world that bison lived in, and he published it in 1990 in a book called Frozen Fauna of the Mammoth Steppe. Ice Age Alaska was not a snowfield. It was grassland. Dry, wind-scoured, sun-exposed, treeless, grass and herb steppe, running unbroken from Spain across Siberia into Alaska and the Yukon. They call it the Mammoth Steppe, and it was the largest single ecosystem on Earth. And notice what's missing from it. No forest. Trees need reliable water and shelter from wind, and there was neither. What grew instead were grasses and low herbs with deep roots and short growing seasons. Plants that thrive on sunlight, drainage, and disturbance, and die under shade and standing water. And it was crowded. Mammoth, woolly rhino, horse, steppe bison, saiga, muskox, caribou. Hunted by lions, by short-faced bears, by wolves. Guthrie's uncomfortable point, the one he spent decades defending, is that this frozen, hostile world supported more large grazing animals than the same land supports today. Modern Alaska, warm, green, wet, forested, is by that measure emptier. Think about that for a second. The place got warmer and richer looking and lost its animals. So what were those millions of grazers eating in the middle of a glaciation? Grass. Standing dead grass, cured on the stem like hay, still nutritious, still reachable all winter long. Reachable being the word that matters, because grass under thin snow is food. Grass under deep snow is a rumor. And there was one place on Earth where the snow was thinnest of all, where the winter dark lasted for weeks, where the temperature dropped below anything a human body should survive. And people walked in anyway, on purpose. Siberia, 71 degrees north, the site that shouldn't exist. The Yana River runs north through Arctic Siberia and empties into the Arctic Ocean. About 60 miles from that outlet, a Russian geologist hunting fossils found something sticking out of an eroding riverbank. It was a foreshaft, the detachable business end of a spear, carved from the horn of a woolly rhinoceros. Excavations began in 2001 under Vladimir Petulko of the Institute for the History of Material Culture in St. Petersburg. What his team pulled out of that bank and published in Science in January 2004 was the kind of result that makes an entire field stop and reread the abstract. Yana RHS sits at 71 degrees north, deep inside the Arctic Circle, and it dates to 27,000 radiocarbon years before present, in the middle of a glaciation. Before Yana, the earliest accepted human presence anywhere in the Arctic was a site called Barilek at around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. Petulko's date was twice as old. Everyone had assumed eastern Siberia was colonized maybe 20,000 to 22,000 years ago at the earliest. People were already there, at the top of the world, in the cold, thousands of years before that, and they weren't scraping by. The team recovered 376 tools, mammoth ivory foreshafts, a punch or awl made from a wolf's foot bone, snapped during use and then recycled into a second tool because good material was worth keeping. Bones of horse, caribou, hare, birds. Horse, above the Arctic Circle, in a glacial period. Now, here's what makes that so important, and it's the detail that ties this whole video together. Horses cannot dig. A caribou can hammer through a crust with its hooves. A horse can't do much more than sweep snow aside with its muzzle. Deep snow or hard snow, and a horse simply starves standing on top of its own food. So a landscape with horses on it is, by definition, a landscape with almost no snow on it. That's what makes those bones so powerful. They aren't just dinner, they're an instrument. Every horse bone in that layer is a reading taken by an animal that could not have been standing there if the winters had been anything other than bone dry. The presence of those bones is a rainfall gauge. Petulko's people weren't surviving the Arctic despite the glacial climate. They were there because of it. Cold, dry, wind-blasted, and thinly covered meant the herds could feed all winter. And animals that can feed all winter are animals you can hunt all winter. The Arctic was habitable because the Ice Age was a desert. But here's the thing nobody tells you, and it's the moment where everything you assumed about this period turns completely inside out. Moravia, 29,000 years ago, the village made of dust. Southern Czech Republic, two settlements a few kilometers apart, Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov. Between roughly 29,000 and 25,000 years ago, this was one of the densest concentrations of human activity on the planet. The finds are extraordinary. Mammoth bone structures, hearths, a burial of 3 young people arranged together, laid out with deliberate care, red ochre scattered across them. One of the strangest and most human scenes in all of prehistory. The Venus of Dolní Věstonice, a small ceramic female figure, deliberately shaped and fired in a kiln, and the oldest known ceramic object anywhere in the world. Not pottery for cooking, pottery for meaning, thousands of years before anyone thought to make a bowl. And then there's the discovery by Olga Sofer. Working with James Adavazio, she looked at fragments of that fired clay under magnification and found impressions pressed into the surface before firing. Not random, woven. Cordage, netting, and textile, plant fiber, twisted and knotted, 26,000 years ago. So the popular image of the Ice Age hunter in a shapeless hide sack is off by a considerable margin. These people had string, they had nets, they had, functionally, a textile industry, and they had it during the coldest chapter of the last 100,000 years. Nets change everything, by the way. A net doesn't just catch hares and birds. It lets women, children, and the old contribute food alongside the hunters. That isn't a small technical upgrade. That's a different kind of society. But look down. Look at what those camps are built on. Because the hills at Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov are made of less. Less is wind-blown silt. Rock ground into flour by glaciers, dried, lifted by wind off floodplains and steppe, carried, and dropped. It piles up, meters of it, tens of meters. It is exactly the same material Fabrice Lambert measured falling on Antarctica, the 25-fold dust. Here it is again, at the other end of the same story, and it is not a footnote to the site. It is the site. Loess holds water like a sponge and drains without waterlogging. It grows grass. Grass feeds mammoth and horse and reindeer. Mammoth and horse and reindeer feed people. The dust was not the hardship these people endured. The dust was the resource. And that inverts the entire premise. Everything you assumed about this period is backwards. The Ice Age didn't nearly kill our ancestors by being cold. Cold is survivable. You can burn bone. You can sew a fitted coat. You can build a windbreak out of a mammoth's skull. Humans solved cold. What humans have never solved is water in the wrong state at the wrong time. Cold and dry is a pantry. Cold and wet is a sealed vault with the food locked inside. The enemy was never temperature, it was precipitation, which sets up the obvious, terrible question. If thin snow was keeping this entire world alive, the grass, the herds, the hunters at 71 degrees north, what happens on the day the snow finally comes back? China, the last glacial maximum, a plateau made of sky. Fly over north-central China and you'll cross something that looks wrong. A landscape of soft yellow hills, cut by gorges with vertical walls that stand up like carved stone, but crumble in your hand. Caves dug straight into the cliffs, villages living inside them. This is the Chinese Loess Plateau, and it covers an area comparable to France. In places at Luchuan, geologists have measured the deposit at over 150 meters deep. None of it is bedrock. All of it fell out of the air. Every particle in that plateau was ground off the mountains of Central Asia, lifted by wind off dried basins and glacial outwash, carried east and dropped. The Chinese Loess Plateau is a pile of ancient weather, and because it stacks in layers, it reads like an ice core made of dirt. Thick, pale, coarse layers, glacial. Dark red-brown layers where the dust slowed and soil formed, interglacial. The same rhythm Lambert found in Antarctica, written a continent away in a completely different medium. Two archives, two hemispheres, two completely different materials, and they agree line for line. That's what a real result looks like. The peak of that deposition lines up with the coldest window of the whole period. Peter Clark and colleagues, writing in Science in 2009, placed the last glacial maximum between about 26,500 and 19,000 years ago, the interval when the ice sheets stopped growing and simply sat at maximum. And at maximum, the sea was roughly 125 meters lower than it is today. Now, here's what makes that number the hinge of this entire video, and almost nobody says it out loud. Sea level didn't drop because water disappeared. It dropped because water moved. 125 meters of ocean evaporated, blown inland, dumped as snow, and frozen into ice sheets that never gave it back. That water was subtracted from the ocean, and it was subtracted from the sky at the same time. And look at what surfaced when the sea pulled back. A land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, wide enough to be its own country. Dry ground where the North Sea is now. Coastlines sitting kilometers out from where you'd find them today. Millions of square kilometers of fresh, bare, unvegetated seabed, drying in the wind, ready to fly. So the colder the planet got, the more of its water was locked in a solid, and the drier the air above became. Continental shelves surfaced and dried into dust factories. Rivers shrank. Forests retreated into scattered refuges. and the wind, screaming off ice sheets kilometers high, picked all of it up and moved it. Peak ice equals peak desert. Not and also equals. Every mammoth on the Moravian steppe, every horse at Yana, every human alive at 71 degrees north was standing on the far side of that trade. The ice sheets took the water out of circulation, and in doing so, left the ground bare, the grass exposed, and the herds fed. The frozen world was open for business precisely because it was starving for rain. Which means the danger to all of it was never the cold getting worse, it was the cold getting better. Greenland, 14,700 years ago, the day it started snowing. There's a moment in the Greenland ice cores you can find with your finger. The layers change, the dust drops away, the chemistry jumps. Scientists call it the onset of the bowling, and it's dated to about 14,700 years ago. That is the moment the world started warming out of the Ice Age. And warming does one thing above all others. It puts water back in the air. Warmer atmosphere, more evaporation, more moisture, more precipitation. The Greenland cores record it directly. A large, abrupt jump in snow accumulation at that transition, measured by Richard Alley and his colleagues layer by annual layer. Later, at the end of the Younger Dryas, about 11,600 years ago, they clocked the same kind of shift happening possibly within 1 to 3 years. Read that again, not 1 to 3 centuries. Alley's team put the snowfall doubling at the Younger Dryas termination inside a window of a few years. That's inside a single human life. Somebody was born into one world and buried in another, and nothing about their tools or their language or their choices had anything to do with it. Think about what that means on the ground, not in a core, on the ground, where the animals are. A steppe that has been dry for tens of thousands of years starts getting snow that doesn't blow away, snow deep enough to bury the standing grass. Meltwater with nowhere to drain sits on frozen subsoil and turns firm ground into bog. Wet, waterlogged soil favors moss and shrubs and eventually trees, and moss is not food. A mammoth needs an enormous volume of grass every single day, and there is no version of a woolly mammoth that survives on peat. The mammoth steppe, the biggest ecosystem on Earth, the one that fed our ancestors from Spain to the Yukon, didn't get killed by ice. It drowned. It got wet and green and gentle, and it starved everything standing on it. Guthrie's uncomfortable observation is the same fact seen from the other end. The land warmed, the land greened, and the land emptied. And that's where the honest answer lives. We don't know exactly how much of the extinction was climate and how much was human hunting. That argument has run for 50 years, and it isn't settled. What is not in dispute is the sequence. The water came back first. Watch what people do next, because it tells you how bad it got. The big game specialists stop being big game specialists. Fish bones and shellfish and bird bones climb in the rubbish heaps. Grinding stones appear. Within a few thousand years, in a handful of places, somebody starts putting seeds in the ground on purpose. So, the snow arrived, the grass vanished, the herds collapsed, and the people who had built an entire way of life out of dust and thin snow had to become something else. That's the story from the ice, from the mud, from the bone. It's tens of thousands of years old, and you have to take a certain amount of it on trust, unless somebody filmed it happening. Yamal Peninsula, Siberia, November 2013. The Yamal Peninsula juts north out of West Siberia into the Kara Sea. Its name, in the Nenets language, translates roughly as the end of the world. About 6,000 Nenets herders live here, moving semi-domesticated reindeer across distances of up to 1,200 kilometers a year. They are among the last genuinely nomadic peoples in the Arctic, and their calendar is set by one thing: where the snow is soft enough to dig. Reindeer feed all winter by pushing through snow with their hooves to reach lichen and dead plant matter underneath. They can smash a crust about 2 centimeters thick. That's the tolerance. That's the whole margin. In early November 2013, it rained. Not a shower. Rain that fell for around 24 hours and soaked the entire snow column, top to bottom, all the way down to the ground. Then the temperature crashed back to normal Arctic values. The whole peninsula turned into a sheet of ice welded to the earth. Bruce Forbes of the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland published the account in Biology Letters in 2016, after interviewing 60 herders and administrators between 2014 and 2016. In a normal year, he explained, crusted patches are ordinary, and a herd can simply be walked to softer ground. This time, there was no softer ground. The ice locked animals out of pastures across roughly 27,000 square kilometers of southern Yamal. Not a crust they could break. A lid. 61,000 reindeer starved to death. 22% of a herd of 275,000. The largest recorded reindeer mortality episode in the region's history. 7 years earlier, in November 2006, the same thing had taken about 20,000 more. Now, here's what makes that so important, and it is the reason this whole video exists. The grass was still there. The lichen was still there. Every gram of food those animals needed was underneath them, unharmed, perfectly preserved, 6 inches down. They starved standing on top of a full pantry with the door frozen shut. And notice the cause. It didn't get colder, it got warmer. Warm enough for rain instead of snow, in a place that had never expected rain in November. Forbes and his team linked those events to brief periods of sea ice thinning in the Barents and Kara seas. The warmth put water in the air, the water fell as liquid, and the liquid killed 61,000 animals in a week. The herders themselves told the researchers this happens roughly once a decade, and that it is getting worse. They have a word for it. They have always had a word for it. It is the thing their whole way of life is organized around avoiding. That is not a metaphor for what ended the Ice Age world. It is the same mechanism at small scale, filmed, dated, witnessed, and mourned by people who are still alive. 14,700 years ago, that happened to a continent. What the dust became. So we come back to the question this started with. If it barely snowed during the Ice Age, what was falling instead? You already know. Dust. 25 times the modern load, year after year, for tens of thousands of years, drifting down and piling up. And here's the last reversal, the one I've been holding since the first minute. That dust is still here. It never washed away because there was nothing to wash it. It settled and it stayed. And today, geologists estimate wind-blown silt of this kind covers something on the order of 1/10 of the land surface of this planet. You have walked on it. Look at what's grown there. The black earth of Ukraine, the Chernozem, some of the most fertile soil ever measured, sits on Ice Age less. Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, the deep, absurdly productive soils of the American Midwest are built on silt that fell out of glacial winds. The Palouse of eastern Washington, the wheat belt of Argentina. In each case, the sequence is identical. Glaciers grind rock into flour. Drought stops the rain from pinning it down. Wind takes it, and it lands somewhere else and waits. And it waits well. Less is loose, deep, free of stones, and easy to break with a wooden stick, which is exactly what the first farmers had. It is almost the only soil on Earth a person with no metal and no plow animal can actually farm. The disaster made the soil. The single driest, dustiest, most hostile stretch of time our species has ever endured produced the ground that every agricultural civilization since has been standing on. Farming didn't begin on pristine land. It began on the debris of a catastrophe. And it isn't finished. Dust off the Sahara still crosses the Atlantic every year and fertilizes the Amazon. The system that buried the Ice Age is running right now, above your head, quietly. Go back to Dolní Věstonice. 29,000 years ago, someone is standing on a hill of packed silt in Moravia, breathing air thick enough to taste, with grit in their hair and grit in their food and grit in their lungs. Mammoth bone stacked behind them, fired clay cooling by the hearth, cordage twisted from plant fiber in their hands. They had no idea they were living through a drought. They had no word for loss. They just knew the ground was soft, the grass was standing, the herds came through, and the snow, think whatever they thinked, stayed thin. They weren't waiting for the world to get better. As far as they knew, this was the world, and it was working. That grit in their lungs is the same material under the wheat that made your bread. And it's the same material drifting through the light in your window right now. The thing you were going to wipe off the shelf without a second thought. Dust. Every civilization you have ever heard of was grown in it. Every meal you have ever eaten came out of ground that a dying, freezing, desperate planet exhaled over 100,000 years and left behind for you. The Ice Age never buried us in snow. It buried us in dust, and every meal you will ever eat still grows out of it.